Richard M. Nixon, number 37, the only president ever to resign from office, even though kids today think he's just that little robot from Futurama. He was born in California in 1913. His parents were Quakers. They were very, very poor. In fact, so poor, the only way Nixon was able to go to college was that two of his brothers died of tuberculosis. This was very traumatic for the family. Then he met Thelma Ryan, fell in love with her, but she kind of snubbed him. But Nixon, just to be close to her, would drive her around when she went on dates with other boys. Eventually, she came around, they got married, and they had two girls, Tricia and Julie. Nixon became a lawyer, then he got into politics, became a congressman and a senator, and he was ruthless with his political enemies. He would pound away at you, and even if he was wrong, he would keep on pounding away until he caught you in a lie. And he would say later on, it was a lie that would get you. And a lot of them started calling him Tricky Dick for his ruthless ways. When Eisenhower picked Nixon to be his running mate for the presidential campaign in 1952, well, some allegations came out that Nixon was receiving bribes, or I should say gifts. And Nixon, as senator, said, well, he did receive some gifts from well-wishing friends, and that one of these gifts was a little Cocker Spaniel they called Checkers, and the children loved the dog, and they weren't going to give it back. His heartwarming little speech on television, well, it was manipulative, but it was effective. Everybody loved it. And needless to say, well, they won the election. And after that, well, Eisenhower would send Nixon out to meet Khrushchev in Soviet Union and also to speak to Fidel Castro of Cuba. And that's where, well, Nixon made his mark. He did, however, have an unpleasant experience in Peru where students spat at him and his wife, threw rocks, and almost turned his car over while they were yelling, "Muera Nixon." In 1960, he ran for president against John F. Kennedy. Well, you all know that he lost, but after that, he ran for governor of California and lost again. He thought his political career was finished, but slowly he rebuilt his political career, making connections, became corporate lawyer to Pepsi-Cola, and then knowing that Johnson was very vulnerable because of the situation in Vietnam, he said, I could win in 1968. So he decided to run again. There were three candidates that year, Nixon of the Republican Party, Hubert Humphrey for the Democratic Party, and Governor George Wallace running as an independent. Yes, that George Wallace, the one who tried blocking black students from going into the University of Alabama. Now, LBJ had pushed for peace talks in Paris, but the Vietnamese canceled at the last moment. Many, including President Johnson, suspected Nixon's people had spoken to Ho Chi Minh and persuaded him to wait until after the election to get a better deal with Nixon. Did Nixon know, or did his people act alone? We'll never know, but in any case, Nixon won. His daughter, Julie, got married before the inauguration, and at the inauguration, anti-war demonstrators yelled at him and threw beer cans at his car. This was strange since he had promised to end the war in Vietnam. Nobody knew that the war would last another 4 years. Now I have to stop to talk about Cambodia. Throughout the Vietnam War, Cambodia remained neutral. It was right on the border. It wanted to stay safe. Now, President Johnson had pressured Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia to help the United States. Sihanouk said Cambodia would stay neutral. Rumors broke out that the U.S. would help rebels overthrow Sihanouk. Well, he broke relations with the United States and, well, he asked North Vietnam for military aid. In exchange, he would allow North Vietnam to set camps up in Cambodia. LBJ was pressured to bomb Cambodia, but he refused. But now Nixon, who had promised to end the war, extended the Vietnam War into Cambodia. He gave the go-ahead and the bombing started, but he kept it a secret. He didn't tell the public or Congress or even several military leaders. Even the pilots weren't told where they were going. And for 6 months, the United States dropped 3 times more bombs in Cambodia than they dropped on Japan in World War II. Over 100,000 civilians were killed. Of course, the truth did come out. Nixon defended his actions, saying that he bombed Cambodia only to hasten the end of the Vietnam War. What were the effects of the bombing? Well, it led to civil war in Cambodia, the overthrow of the government with help from the CIA, then the Khmer Rouge took over the country, and then came genocide. And in the end, over 3 million Cambodians lost their lives to the bombings, genocide, war, and famine. Laos. Another country that had the bad luck of bordering North Vietnam. You see, North Vietnamese communists were transporting, secretly or not, military weapons across routes through Cambodia and Laos. So the U.S. bombed Laos too. Between 1964 and 1973, the U.S. military dropped 260 million cluster bombs in Laos, over 560,000 bombing missions. This is equivalent to a plane load of bombs being dropped every 8 minutes, 24 hours a day for 9 years. Now, a third of these bombs failed to go off. So today, there are about 300 civilians that die in Laos every year when they run into and pick up a sitting bomb laying in a rice field or on a road. The United States is helping to clear up these bombs, but it takes hours to defuse just one. At the present rate, it would take 3,000 years to get rid of all of them. March 16, 1968 occurred the worst massacre of the war by American troops. Now, because of miscommunication, it sounds like, U.S. Army soldiers went into a village in My Lai and killed between 347 to 504 unarmed civilians. The victims were men, women, children, even babies. Some women were gang raped and their bodies mutilated. 26 soldiers were charged, but only the leader, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted to life in prison. However, President Nixon intervened and had him moved to the United States for house arrest, where he only served 3.5 years. Now, most American troops served honorably, but nevertheless, anti-war protests increased. And when Nixon spoke to some of his supporters and praised them, he said that these college students that were protesting the war were bums. So, when a protest broke out at Kent State University and the National Guard got involved, opened fire, and killed 4 college students, the parent of one of these students said, "Mr. President, my son was not a bum." That year, when dairy farmer Max Yasgur leased his farmland so a few hippies could hold a music festival, well, over 400,000 showed up for 3 days of rock music, drugs, anti-war protests, rain and mud. It was Woodstock. There were 32 musical acts during that rainy weekend, and it was a definitive symbol for the counterculture generation. Then, on July 20, 1969, the nation watched their television sets with pride. 3 American astronauts reached the moon, fulfilling the dream of the NASA program. Around that time, The Godfather was published, the Beatles broke up, and then Charles Manson and his cult followers killed 5 people, including 8-month pregnant Sharon Tate. And then, remarkably, Richard Nixon, Mr. Big Anti-Communist himself, reached out to Communist China to open relations. Well, they had ping-pong tournaments between their athletes, and there were trade agreements. There was talk to have more talks. Nixon visited Chairman Mao Zedong and the Chinese Wall. And then the Soviets, fearing this new U.S.-Chinese relationship, reached out to Nixon, and they agreed to have a series of talks to limit arms and develop more free trade. This was Nixon's simultaneous trilateral negotiation. It was a success. But then in June 1971, a military analyst named Daniel Ellsberg, well, he became disillusioned with the war and leaked government documents to the press. They were called the Pentagon Papers. Nixon's men tried to block the publication but failed. Then Nixon ordered some men to discredit Ellsberg. They broke into his psychiatrist's office to see what they could find. Well, Ellsberg was indicted for releasing classified documents, but because the judge found out that the government had raided Ellsberg's doctor's office, he threw the case out of court. Nixon became paranoid and began to tape record all his meetings and phone conversations, and he hired Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy to become what they called plumbers, to kind of stop the leaks that were happening. He also had a lot of his staff members involved. There were audits, threats. They discredited reputations of their enemies, and Nixon even got his own little enemies list. And then, in Chile, Salvador Allende was elected president. He was freely elected, but because he was a Marxist, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, said that we could not allow the irresponsibility of the Chilean people to put a Marxist in power. So the CIA helped overthrow Salvador Allende, and then, well, President Allende committed suicide. 1972, Nixon was running for re-election, and at the Watergate Hotel, the Democrats had their Democratic headquarters, and the Plumbers, a group of misfits and former CIA agents, broke into the Democratic headquarters to bug the place and steal some files. And no, it wasn't Forrest Gump who happened to be there who called security. It was a random security guard who saw what was going on and called the police. 5 men were arrested, but despite this, well, Nixon won by a huge landslide. He was re-elected overwhelmingly. Nevertheless, the FBI started the investigation, and 2 reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, kept the story alive for years. They even had an insider, a little spy they called Deep Throat. Today we know that spy was Mark Felt of the FBI. Now, Nixon asked the CIA to tell the FBI to stop. By the way, that's obstruction of justice. It didn't work, but Nixon decided, well, to appear fair, he hired Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox, a Democrat, to investigate the matter. And when counsel John Dean told Nixon it would take money to keep all these people involved quiet, Nixon said, okay. Where was the money coming from? It was coming from the committee to re-elect the president. So, donations to Nixon's campaign were used as hush money for all those involved. Then, Nixon asked his aide, John Dean, to write a long, detailed report about Watergate and sign it. John Dean suspected that Nixon was trying to get him to take all the blame, to be the fall guy. So what did John Dean do? He went before the congressional hearing and he talked. He told them everything. He implicated everybody, including President Nixon. In between all of this, well, a Paris Peace Accord was signed. The Vietnam War was over. People were so jubilant. They were happy. The American POWs were finally coming home. Nixon was ecstatic, but well, the news was about to get bad. Very bad. You see, a man named Alexander Buttlesworth was pulled before the hearings, and in defending himself about Watergate, he made a few comments. When he was asked if he could corroborate any of this, he said yes, of course. The president kept all his meetings and phone conversations on tape. Well, this was a bombshell. Now, Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox asked Nixon to provide those tapes. Well, Nixon refused, and then he told the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Special Prosecutor Cox. When Richardson refused, Nixon forced him to resign. And then Nixon asked Deputy Assistant Director William Ruckelshaus to fire Cox. Ruckelshaus refused, and then he resigned. And finally, Nixon asked Solicitor General Robert Bork to fire Archibald Cox, and he did. So, Cox was out, and then a new Special Prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, was in. Nevertheless, to no avail, Jaworski also asked for the Nixon tapes. The country was stunned, but Nixon, he decided to compromise. Instead of the tapes, he offered transcripts, where he would, of course, block out anything that he found that might be dangerous of national security. But there was an 18-and-a-half-minute gap in those tapes. And, well, Nixon said the Secretary, Rosemary Woods, erased those 18 minutes by accident. Then it was discovered that the Vice President, Spiro Agnew, was under investigation as well. He had accepted bribes from a construction company when he was governor of Maryland, and he kept on getting bribes while he was in the White House. He was forced to resign, and then a new Vice President, Gerald Ford, was sworn in. Well, the anti-war protesters became anti-Nixon protesters, and Nixon decided to come out on television to state his case and defend himself. What did he say? Well, basically, he said that he wasn't a crook. And while Nixon was saying to everybody that he wasn't a crook, Idi Amin took over Uganda. 2 new books came out, Carrie and Jaws. Muhammad Ali had regained his heavyweight title, and in Munich, a group of terrorists killed several Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympics. And the reporters of the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, they won a Pulitzer Prize for investigation for their newspaper. And then their book, All the President's Men, came out, which also won an award. And then it was made into a movie with Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. Governor Wallace, who thought about running for president again, was shot But he didn't die, he was just paralyzed. It was around this time that Nixon decided enough was enough. He decided to resign, made a very sad speech, and well, his family looked on, and after that, they just got on the plane and went home. Vice President Gerald Ford became the new president. And as for his staff, well, let's see. Nixon retired in disgrace, wrote several books, and when he passed away at the age of 91, 5 U.S. presidents attended his funeral. This is Cool Talk.